Joe Colombo, the Mafia boss who built a political movement. Part 1. The Brooklyn Beginnings. Joseph Anthony Colombo Sr. was born on June 16, 1923, in Brooklyn, New York, into a world where the lines between Italian immigrant community and organized crime were often blurred. His father, Anthony Colombo, was himself connected to the mob, a reality that would shape young Joe's entire life. Brooklyn in the 1920s and 1930s was a melting pot of immigrant communities, each carving out their territory and survival in America. The Italian neighborhoods of Bensonhurst, Bath Beach, and Dyker Heights formed tight-knit enclaves where Old World traditions mixed with New World opportunities, both legitimate and criminal. Joe's childhood took a dark turn in 1938 when he was just 15 years old. His father, Anthony Colombo, was found strangled in a car, his body dumped in a vacant lot. The murder was never solved, but everyone understood it was a mob hit. Anthony had crossed someone powerful, and he paid with his life. This traumatic event could have pushed young Joe away from the underworld. Instead, it drew him deeper into it. He understood the code of that world, that his father's death demanded respect, that showing weakness invited further violence, and that power came from the barrel of a gun and the loyalty of strong men. Joe Colombo dropped out of high school and drifted through various jobs. He worked as a longshoreman on the Brooklyn docks, where corruption and mob control were facts of daily life. But these legitimate jobs were covers for his real education, learning the ways of organized crime. In 1944, at age 21, Colombo married Lucille Fiello. The couple would have 5 children together: Joseph Jr., Anthony, Vincent, Catherine, and Robin. Colombo presented himself as a devoted family man, attending church regularly and maintaining a home in the respectable Brooklyn neighborhood of Dyker Heights. But behind the facade of normalcy, Colombo was building connections in the underworld. He became associated with the Profaci crime family, one of New York's 5 major mafia organizations. The family was named after Giuseppe "Joe" Profaci, a powerful boss who had been a major figure since the Castellamarese War of the early 1930s. Joe Profaci ran his family like a business, and a strict one at that. He demanded monthly tribute payments from his subordinates and maintained tight control over rackets. Profaci was old-school Sicilian, adhering to traditions and expecting absolute loyalty and respect. Joe Colombo started as a low-level associate, running errands and proving his reliability. Unlike some young mobsters who sought attention and glory, Colombo was patient and calculating. He understood that survival in the mob required more than toughness; it required intelligence and political skill. Throughout the 1950s, Colombo rose through the ranks. He became involved in various criminal enterprises, gambling operations, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. He also cultivated relationships with other mobsters, understanding that connections mattered as much as capability in this world. The Profaci family during this period was relatively peaceful compared to other New York families. Profaci maintained good relations with the other bosses and avoided the internecine conflicts that occasionally erupted in the underworld. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Many younger members of the Profaci family resented the boss's demands for tribute and his autocratic leadership style. They felt they were paying too much and receiving too little in return. Among the discontented were the Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert Crazy Joe, and Joey Gallo, ambitious young mobsters who wanted more power and profit. The Gallos began recruiting other dissatisfied family members for a rebellion against Profaci. This was an extraordinarily dangerous move. Challenging a sitting boss violated fundamental mafia rules and invited brutal retaliation. In February 1961, the First Colombo War began, when the Gallo faction kidnapped several Profaci loyalists, including underboss Joseph Magliocco and 3 Profaci captains. The Gallos demanded that Profaci end the tribute system and give them more power within the family. Profaci pretended to negotiate while planning his response. He ordered hits on the Gallo brothers and their supporters. The conflict erupted into open warfare. Bodies appeared in the streets. Businesses associated with either faction became targets. Joe Colombo found himself firmly in Profaci's camp. He wasn't a fence-sitter or someone who tried to remain neutral. Colombo understood that loyalty to the boss was non-negotiable, and more practically, Profaci had the power to win this war. The conflict dragged on through 1961 and into 1962. Several men on both sides were killed. The Gallos survived multiple assassination attempts through luck and cunning. They held out in a fortified basement headquarters they called the dormitory, rarely venturing outside with heavy protection. But the Gallos were losing. They couldn't match Profaci's resources or manpower. Other crime families, following the Commission's support of Profaci as the legitimate boss, isolated the rebels. The Gallos found themselves trapped, unable to operate freely or generate income. Joe Profaci died of liver cancer on June 6, 1962, before the war reached a final conclusion. His death could have created an opportunity for the Gallos to make peace or seize power. Instead, Profaci's brother-in-law and underboss, Joseph Magliocco, became the new boss and continued the war against the rebels. Colombo remained loyal to the new administration, continuing to prove his worth through both his criminal acumen and his willingness to use violence when necessary. His loyalty during the war would soon be rewarded in ways he couldn't have imagined. The stage was set for Joe Colombo's rapid ascent to power, an ascent that would be as surprising as it was controversial within the traditionally conservative world of the American Mafia. If you made it this far, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe. That's how we know you're really in the room, and it gives us the push to keep this project rolling. Part 2. The Unlikely Rise to Power. Joseph Magliocco's tenure as boss of the Profaci family was brief and disastrous. The new boss made a decision that would cost him everything and inadvertently elevate Joe Colombo to leadership. In 1963, Joseph Bonanno, boss of one of New York's 5 families, allegedly approached Magliocco with an audacious proposal. They would assassinate several other commission members, including Carlo Gambino and Thomas Lucchese, and take control of the New York underworld. The plan was insane by any measure. The Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, had been established precisely to prevent such power grabs. Assassinating multiple bosses would trigger a war that would devastate the entire organization and bring enormous law enforcement heat. Magliocco, either believing the plan could work or feeling he couldn't refuse Bonanno, agreed to participate. But he made a crucial error. He delegated the actual assassination to Joe Colombo, ordering him to organize and execute the hits on Gambino and Lucchese. Colombo faced an impossible situation. If he carried out the order, he would be starting a war that would likely destroy the family and possibly get him killed. If he refused, Magliocco would probably have him killed for insubordination. Colombo made the choice that would define his career. He went to the intended victims and revealed the plot. The exact details of what happened next remain debated, but the outcome is clear. Carlo Gambino, the powerful and cunning boss of the Gambino family, learned of the assassination plot. The commission summoned Magliocco to answer for his betrayal. Magliocco appeared before the commission in late 1963. The bosses were furious. He had violated the fundamental principle that governed their world. The commission was supposed to prevent such conflicts, not become a target for ambitious bosses. Magliocco pleaded for his life, blaming Bonanno for instigating the plot. The commission faced a dilemma. Executing a boss would create instability and potentially trigger war with loyalists, but letting such a serious violation go unpunished would undermine the commission's authority. They reached a compromise. Magliocco would retire immediately, step down as boss, and pay a substantial fine, reportedly $50,000. He would live but in disgrace and stripped of power. Joseph Bonanno faced a summons to appear before the commission, though he would resist, triggering what became known as the Banana War. The commission needed to appoint a new boss for the Profaci family. The choice was not obvious. The family was still divided from the Gallo War. They needed someone acceptable to all factions, someone with no obvious enemies, someone who wouldn't threaten the other families. Carlo Gambino, the most powerful figure on the commission, reportedly pushed for Joe Colombo. By revealing the assassination plot, Colombo had effectively demonstrated loyalty to the commission over his own boss, exactly the kind of thinking the other bosses wanted to encourage. On December 28, 1963, just weeks after Magliocco's forced retirement, Joseph Magliocco died of a heart attack. Whether the heart attack was natural or induced remains a subject of speculation, but the timing was certainly convenient for the transition. In early 1964, at approximately 41 years old, Joseph Colombo became boss of what would soon be renamed the Colombo crime family. It was an extraordinary rise for someone who had been a mere soldier just years earlier. Colombo's elevation shocked many in the underworld. He had effectively skipped the traditional progression through the ranks. He hadn't been a captain or underboss before becoming boss. Some viewed him as Carlo Gambino's puppet, installed to control the family and ensure it wouldn't threaten Gambino's interests. There was truth to this perception. Colombo owed his position to Gambino and the commission. He understood that his power depended on maintaining good relations with the other families, particularly the Gambinos. But Colombo proved more capable than his detractors expected. He moved quickly to consolidate power within his family. He promoted loyalists to key positions and worked to heal the divisions from the Gallo War. The Gallo faction remained a problem. Larry Gallo died of cancer in 1968, removing one of the rebellion's leaders, but Crazy Joe Gallo remained active, though he had been imprisoned in 1961 for extortion and wouldn't be released until 1971. Colombo expanded the family's rackets. They controlled gambling operations, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. They had influence in the garment district, food distribution, and various labor unions. Like all mob families, they generated millions annually through a combination of illegal activities and infiltration of legitimate businesses. Colombo also cultivated a public image. Unlike most bosses who avoided publicity, Colombo began appearing publicly, presenting himself as a successful businessman. He claimed his income came from a real estate company he owned. He dressed conservatively, spoke articulately, and projected an air of respectability. This public presence was unusual for a mafia boss. The traditional approach was to remain invisible, avoid media attention, and deny the mafia's very existence. Carlo Gambino, the most powerful New York boss, lived modestly and avoided cameras. Even his own neighbors often didn't know who he was. But Colombo seemed to believe that the old ways were outdated. He thought that Italian Americans could defend themselves against what he saw as ethnic discrimination and stereotyping. This belief would soon lead him to create something unprecedented in mafia history. The seeds of this movement were already germinating. Colombo and other Italian Americans resented how movies, television, and law enforcement portrayed their community as synonymous with organized crime. The stereotype damaged all Italian Americans, they argued, not just the criminals. Within a few years, Joe Colombo would transform this resentment into organized political action, creating a movement that would make him famous, powerful, and ultimately a target. Part 3. The FBI Catalyst. The event that transformed Joe Colombo from obscure mob boss into national figure began with his son's arrest on April 30, 1970. FBI agents arrested Joseph Colombo Jr., age 23, on charges of melting down coins for their silver content, a federal crime. The younger Colombo faced charges that seemed relatively minor compared to typical organized crime prosecutions. Joe Colombo reacted with fury. He claimed the arrest was persecution, that law enforcement targeted his son solely because of the family name. Whether the charge was legitimate or not, Colombo saw it as an opportunity to make a larger point about what he characterized as anti-Italian discrimination. On June 29, 1970, Colombo organized a protest. Approximately 50 people, mostly Italian Americans from Brooklyn, picketed FBI headquarters in Manhattan. They carried signs reading "Italian Americans, Stop FBI" and "FBI, Innocent Until Proven Guilty." The protest attracted media attention. Reporters were surprised to see a mob boss, and Colombo didn't deny his leadership position, openly confronting the FBI. It violated everything the mob traditionally stood for: secrecy, avoiding attention, denying the organization's existence. But Colombo saw the protest differently. He was tapping into genuine frustration within the Italian-American community about stereotyping and discrimination. The FBI and law enforcement did tend to focus disproportionately on Italian organized crime, while other ethnic criminal organizations operated with less scrutiny. Italian Americans were constantly depicted in media as gangsters or buffoons. The protest grew. More people joined subsequent demonstrations. Italian-American business owners, professionals, and working-class families who had no connection to organized crime began showing up. They were tired of being associated with the mafia simply because of their heritage. Colombo recognized the potential. He formalized the movement by creating the Italian-American Civil Rights League in July 1970. The organization's stated mission was to combat discrimination against Italian Americans and promote positive images of Italian culture and heritage. The League grew explosively. Within months, it claimed over 45,000 members. Chapters opened across the United States. The organization held rallies, fundraisers, and protests. They demanded that the media stop using terms like Mafia and Cosa Nostra, arguing these terms unfairly stigmatized an entire ethnic group. Major Italian-American celebrities joined or supported the League. Singer and actor Frank Sinatra performed at League fundraisers. Actor Anthony Quinn supported the organization. Numerous prominent Italian-American politicians attended League events, seeking the support of what appeared to be a massive grassroots movement. The first Italian Unity Day rally, held on June 29, 1970, the anniversary of the first FBI protest, drew an estimated 50,000 people to Columbus Circle in Manhattan. Attendees heard speeches about Italian pride, discrimination, and the contributions of Italian Americans to society. The event raised substantial funds for the League. Politicians courted Colombo's endorsement. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller appeared at League events. Congressmen and local officials sought League support for their campaigns. The organization wielded genuine political influence through its ability to mobilize voters and donations. The League achieved notable successes. They pressured filmmakers to remove Mafia references from scripts. The Justice Department reportedly issued a directive limiting the use of terms like Mafia and Cosa Nostra in official communications. Major corporations and advertisers became cautious about Italian stereotypes in advertising. Perhaps most remarkably, The Godfather, the film based on Mario Puzo's best-selling novel, became a target. The League protested the production, fearing it would reinforce negative stereotypes. Producer Albert S. Ruddy negotiated with the League, ultimately agreeing to remove the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra from the film's dialogue in exchange for the League's cooperation. But beneath the surface of this civil rights movement, serious questions lurked. Where was the League's money going? Who was really running the organization? And what was Joe Colombo's actual agenda? FBI investigations revealed that the League was essentially a Colombo family operation. Meetings were held at locations controlled by the crime family. League officials included known Colombo family members and associates. Funds raised through the organization were allegedly diverted to personal use and criminal enterprises. The League provided Colombo with something invaluable, a shield of legitimacy. How could law enforcement prosecute a civil rights leader? How could they surveil someone who was simply fighting discrimination? The organization made it politically difficult for authorities to target Colombo. Other Mafia bosses watched Colombo's activities with growing alarm. Carlo Gambino, who had sponsored Colombo's rise to boss, was particularly disturbed. The traditional Mafia philosophy was to deny the organization's existence, to avoid publicity, to operate in the shadows. Colombo was doing the opposite, putting himself, and by extension all of organized crime, in the spotlight. Gambino and other bosses reportedly told Colombo to shut down the League and return to traditional mob operations. Colombo refused. He believed the League protected him and enhanced his power. He enjoyed the celebrity and influence. He saw himself as a pioneer, adapting the mob to modern America. The League held a second Italian Unity Day rally on June 28, 1971. The event was even larger than the first, with organizers predicting 75,000 attendees. The rally would feature speeches, entertainment, and demonstrations of Italian-American achievement and pride. Joe Colombo arrived at Columbus Circle that morning as one of the most famous Italian-Americans in the country. He was a successful businessman, a civil rights leader, a man who had stood up to the FBI and won concessions from Hollywood and the government. He would leave Columbus Circle on a stretcher, his brain destroyed by bullets, his movement shattered, and his life effectively over. The second Italian Unity Day rally would be remembered not for celebrating Italian pride, but for the shocking violence that would end Joe Colombo's extraordinary run. Part 4. The Assassination Attempt. June 28, 1971. Columbus Circle, Manhattan. The morning sun shone on what promised to be another triumphant Italian Unity Day rally. Vendors set up booths, organizers tested sound systems. Early arrivals staked out good viewing positions for the speeches and entertainment scheduled to begin at noon. Joe Colombo arrived around 11 a.m. He moved through the growing crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, basking in the attention. Colombo was at the height of his fame and influence. His league had become a national organization. Politicians sought his endorsement. He had forced the FBI and Hollywood to acknowledge his movement's power. Colombo wore a light-colored suit, appropriate for the warm June day. Associates and bodyguards surrounded him, though the security wasn't as tight as it should have been for a mob boss. Colombo seemed to believe that his status as a civil rights leader protected him, that no one would dare attack him at such a public event. He was wrong. At approximately 11:45 a.m., as Colombo stood near the stage greeting supporters, a young African-American man approached. The man was Jerome A. Johnson, age 24, a small-time criminal from New Brunswick, New Jersey. Johnson held a camera and appeared to be a photographer documenting the event. Johnson moved close to Colombo. No one stopped him. In the crowd and commotion, one more photographer seemed unremarkable. Johnson raised what appeared to be a camera. Then he pulled out a gun. Johnson fired 3 shots at point-blank range. The first bullet struck Colombo in the jaw. The second hit him in the back of the neck. The third missed entirely. Colombo collapsed immediately, blood pouring from his wounds. Chaos erupted. People screamed and ran. Some dove to the ground. Others stood frozen in shock. Colombo's bodyguards, who should have been protecting him, scrambled to respond. Within seconds, multiple shots rang out from another direction. Someone, reportedly Colombo family members serving as security, shot Jerome Johnson. He was hit multiple times and fell to the ground. He was either dead or dying before he hit the pavement. Police officers who had been assigned to the rally rushed to the scene. They found Colombo on the ground, unconscious and bleeding severely. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They worked to stabilize Colombo enough to transport him to Roosevelt Hospital, just blocks away from Columbus Circle. Jerome Johnson lay dead, shot multiple times. Police recovered a .32 caliber pistol near his body, the weapon he had used to shoot Colombo. A .38 caliber revolver was found in his possession as well. Who exactly shot Johnson would remain a subject of investigation and controversy. At the hospital, doctors fought to save Colombo's life. The bullets had caused devastating damage. One had entered through his jaw and lodged in his brain. The other had struck his neck, damaging critical structures. Colombo underwent emergency surgery to remove the bullets and repair what damage could be repaired. He survived the surgery, but the prognosis was grim. The bullet in his brain had caused massive trauma. Even if Colombo lived, doctors said he would likely suffer severe permanent disabilities. The shooting shocked New York and the nation. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the mob boss gunned down at his own rally. Television news programs showed footage of the chaos at Columbus Circle. The Italian Unity Day celebration had become the scene of an attempted assassination. Part 5. The Aftermath and Consequences. Joe Colombo survived the shooting, but never truly recovered. He remained in the coma for weeks after the attack. When he finally regained consciousness, the extent of his injuries became clear. He was paralyzed, unable to speak coherently, and required constant medical care. Colombo spent the next 7 years in a vegetative or semi-vegetative state. His family cared for him at home, hoping for improvement that would never come. The vibrant, charismatic mob boss who had built a political movement and challenged the FBI was reduced to a shell, unable to walk, talk, or care for himself. On May 22, 1978, nearly 7 years after the shooting, Joseph Colombo died of cardiac arrest at age 54. The official cause was heart failure, but the real cause was the bullets that had destroyed his brain in 1971. The Italian-American Civil Rights League collapsed almost immediately after the shooting. Without Colombo's leadership and charisma, the organization lost direction and support. Many legitimate members who had genuinely believed in fighting discrimination became disillusioned when they learned about the League's connections to organized crime. By 1972, the League existed in name only. The massive rallies were over. The political influence had evaporated. The money had disappeared into accounts controlled by Colombo family members. The dream of a mass Italian-American civil rights movement died with Colombo's mobility and cognition. The shooting triggered exactly the kind of violence that the commission feared when they allowed Colombo to become boss. The Colombo family blamed Crazy Joe Gallo for the assassination attempt. They wanted revenge. Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo, despite his denials of involvement, became the primary target. The Colombo family began hunting him, waiting for the right opportunity. Gallo, aware of the danger, increased his security and changed his routines. But on April 7, 1972, less than a year after Colombo was shot, Gallo made a fatal mistake. He went to Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy to celebrate his 43rd birthday with his wife, stepdaughter, sister, and bodyguard. Around 5 a.m., as Gallo's party ate an early breakfast, several gunmen entered the restaurant. They immediately opened fire. Gallo was hit multiple times. He tried to flee toward the street but collapsed on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. He died within minutes. The shooting of Joe Gallo was widely attributed to the Colombo family, though no one was ever convicted. Whether Gallo had actually been involved in Colombo's shooting remained uncertain, but in the mob's justice system, suspicion was enough to warrant execution. The Colombo family itself descended into chaos after Joe Colombo's incapacitation. Without his leadership, internal conflicts erupted over who would control the family. Several potential successors emerged, each with their supporters and enemies. Vincent, Jimmy Alloy, briefly served as acting boss, but the family remained fractured. Thomas DeBella later took control, but he too faced challenges. The family that Colombo had led was never the same after his shooting. The Second Colombo War would erupt in the 1990s, a brutal internal conflict that killed numerous members and decimated the family's power. While this war occurred long after Colombo's death, many trace its roots to the instability created by his sudden removal from leadership. Carlo Gambino, who had sponsored Colombo's rise to boss, reportedly expressed relief that Colombo's public activities had ended. Whether Gambino was involved in the shooting remains speculation, but he certainly benefited from Colombo's removal. The spotlight that Colombo had shone on organized crime dimmed after the shooting. Law enforcement's investigation into the Columbus Circle shooting never produced satisfying answers. They established that Jerome Johnson had fired the shots, but who was behind Johnson remained unclear. The FBI investigated connections to Gallo, to rival mob families, and even to political enemies, but couldn't develop conclusive evidence. The speed with which Johnson was killed complicated the investigation. Dead men can't be interrogated. Witnesses provided conflicting accounts of who had shot Johnson. Some said Colombo's bodyguards, others claimed they saw a man in the crowd fire. No one was charged with Johnson's murder. The shooting had broader implications for organized crime. It demonstrated the dangers of public visibility. After Colombo, mob bosses returned to the old model of invisibility. They avoided cameras, refused interviews, and denied the Mafia's existence. The era of the celebrity mobster, briefly embodied by Colombo, was over. The event also showed the limits of political influence in protecting criminals. Colombo believed that his league and his political connections provided immunity from attack. He was wrong. In the end, the old mob rules reasserted themselves. Power came from fear and respect within the organization, not from public relations or political movements. For Italian Americans genuinely concerned about discrimination and stereotyping, the Colombo affair was damaging. It seemed to confirm the worst stereotypes, that Italian civil rights activism was a front for mob operations. Legitimate organizations working to combat anti-Italian discrimination had to distance themselves from anything associated with Colombo or his league. The shooting also revealed the limits of FBI infiltration and understanding the mob. Despite extensive surveillance and investigation, they hadn't predicted the attack or prevented it. The mob's code of silence and cellular structure made it nearly impossible to gather advance intelligence about planned hits. Joe Colombo's family suffered perhaps the most. His wife and children watched him deteriorate over 7 years, a slow death that began on Columbus Circle. His sons attempted to maintain legitimate lives, though some faced their own legal troubles. The Colombo name, once a source of pride and power, became associated with violence and tragedy. The man who tried to change the Mafia's relationship with American society ended up reinforcing every negative stereotype about organized crime, violence, betrayal, and ultimately, a pathetic end. Part 6. The League's True Nature. Law enforcement investigations after the shooting revealed what many had suspected. The Italian-American Civil Rights League was fundamentally a Colombo family operation designed to serve criminal purposes while presenting a legitimate facade. FBI documents and court testimony in subsequent cases painted a detailed picture of how the League functioned. Meetings were often held at venues controlled by the Colombo family. League officers included known mobsters and associates. Decision-making occurred not through democratic processes, but through direction from Colombo and his captains. The League's finances were particularly revealing. The organization raised substantial sums through membership dues, fundraising events, and donations. The first Italian Unity Day rally reportedly raised over $100,000. Corporate sponsors and wealthy Italian Americans contributed generously to what they believed was a civil rights organization. But where did this money go? Very little went to actual civil rights activities. Investigators found that funds were diverted to Colombo family members and operations. Some money went to pay legal fees for mobsters. Some financed Colombo's lifestyle. Much simply disappeared into accounts controlled by the crime family. The League's membership was also questionable. While the organization claimed over 45,000 members at its peak, this number was likely inflated. Many members were Italian Americans who attended a rally or donated money but had no ongoing involvement. Others were Colombo family associates who joined because they were told to. Legitimate Italian Americans who joined the League with genuine intentions to fight discrimination often became disillusioned. They discovered that the organization's priorities weren't civil rights, but protecting mobsters from law enforcement. Meetings focused not on combating stereotypes, but on protesting FBI investigations and criminal prosecutions. The League's tactics revealed its true nature. When they pressured Hollywood to remove Mafia references from films, they weren't fighting stereotypes. They were trying to make it harder for law enforcement to explain to juries what the Mafia was. If the word couldn't be used, prosecutors faced difficulties describing the criminal organization they were prosecuting. Similarly, protests against FBI investigations weren't about civil liberties. They were attempts to intimidate law enforcement and create political pressure to reduce surveillance of mobsters. The League wanted immunity for criminals, not equal rights for Italian Americans. The Justice Department's reported directive to limit use of Mafia and Cosa Nostra was later revealed to be more limited than the League claimed. Officials clarified that they would continue using these terms when accurate and relevant, but would avoid unnecessary ethnic identifications. This was far from the League's portrayal of having forced the government to stop persecuting Italian Americans. Celebrities who had supported the League faced embarrassment after the shooting. Frank Sinatra, who had performed at League fundraisers, distanced himself from the organization. He claimed he hadn't known about its mob connections and had been deceived. Whether this was true or convenient remains debated. Sinatra's own alleged mob connections were well documented. The Godfather controversy became particularly ironic. The League had protested the film, fearing it would reinforce negative stereotypes. Producer Albert Ruddy negotiated with the League, agreeing to remove certain terms from the dialogue. But the film, released in March 1972, became the most celebrated depiction of the Mafia in cinema history. The impact was opposite of what the League intended. The Godfather romanticized organized crime, making mobsters seem honorable and even admirable. It spawned countless imitations and permanently shaped how Americans viewed the Mafia. The League's efforts had failed completely. What the League episode revealed was the difficulty of separating Italian-American identity from Mafia stereotypes when actual mobsters were leading the civil rights movement. Legitimate concerns about discrimination became tainted by association with criminals. Real anti-defamation work by Italian Americans suffered. Organizations like the Order Sons of Italy in America, which had been fighting stereotypes for decades through legitimate means, found their work complicated by the Colombo affair. They had repeatedly explained that they had no connection to the League and opposed using civil rights rhetoric to protect criminals. The League also demonstrated how organized crime adapts to changing times. Joe Colombo recognized that the 1960s and 1970s were an era of civil rights movements and ethnic pride. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other groups were organizing to fight discrimination and demand equal treatment. Colombo tried to hijack this trend for criminal purposes. He used the language of civil rights, discrimination, stereotyping, and equal treatment to shield himself and his organization from law enforcement. It was clever and, for a brief period, remarkably effective. But it was also fundamentally dishonest. The civil rights movements of the 1960s and 1970s were fighting for actual justice and equality. The League was fighting for immunity for criminals. Real civil rights activists marched and were beaten by police for demanding the right to vote or attend integrated schools. The League protested FBI investigations of loan sharking and murder. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies learned important lessons from the League episode. They realized that organized crime would use any tactic, including co-opting civil rights language and movements, to protect their operations. They became more careful about how they communicated about ethnicity and crime, not because the League's arguments were valid, but to avoid providing ammunition for such manipulation. The League's collapse after Colombo's shooting demonstrated its artificiality. A genuine grassroots civil rights movement doesn't collapse when one leader is incapacitated. It continues because it represents real grievances and aspirations of a community. The League died because it was never a real civil rights organization. It was Joe Colombo's creation, serving his purposes. The entire episode stands as a cautionary tale about the intersection of organized crime, ethnic identity, and political movements. It showed how criminals could exploit legitimate concerns for illegitimate purposes. and how difficult it can be to separate genuine activism from criminal manipulation. Part 7. The Colombo Family After Joe Colombo. The Colombo crime family that survived its founder's incapacitation and eventual death in 1978 was a shadow of what it had been during Joe Colombo's leadership. The family that had briefly been in the spotlight of national attention returned to the shadows, but those shadows concealed bitter internal conflicts. The immediate succession was messy. Vincent "Jimmy" Alloy, a respected member who had been close to Colombo, initially served as acting boss. But Alloy lacked the authority and charisma to unite a family that was fracturing along generational and personal lines. Thomas DeBella succeeded Alloy in the mid-1970s. DeBella was an old-school mobster who tried to return the family to traditional operations and away from Colombo's publicity-seeking approach. Under DeBella, the family focused on core criminal activities: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and extortion. The family maintained control over certain rackets, particularly in Brooklyn and parts of Long Island. They had influence in labor unions, especially in the construction and garbage hauling industries. They operated illegal gambling operations and continued loan sharking activities that had been staples of organized crime for generations. But the family was significantly weakened. The publicity from the shooting and the League debacle had brought unwanted federal attention. The internal conflicts over succession created instability, and other New York families, particularly the Gambinos and Genovese, encroached on territories that the Colombos had once controlled. Carmine Jr. Persico emerged as the family's most powerful figure in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Persico was a complicated character, intelligent and ruthless, but also prone to paranoia and poor judgment. He had been involved in the Gallo Wars of the 1960s and harbored grudges that would eventually contribute to another devastating internal conflict. Persico was convicted of racketeering in 1986 as part of the famous commission case that sent the bosses of New York's major crime families to prison. He received a 39-year sentence, followed by a 100-year sentence for additional racketeering charges in 1987. Persico would die in prison in 2019, but his influence over the Colombo family continued for decades, even from behind bars. The commission case was a watershed moment for all New York crime families. For the first time, federal prosecutors successfully used RICO statutes to convict the bosses of multiple families for running criminal enterprises. The case demonstrated that the government finally had tools effective against organized crime structure. For the Colombo family, already weakened by internal problems and leadership instability, the commission case was devastating. With Persico imprisoned and unable to lead effectively, the family descended into confusion over who should actually run operations. This confusion exploded into open warfare in 1991, triggering what became known as the Third Colombo War. The conflict pitted loyalists of imprisoned boss Carmine Persico against a faction led by Victor "Little Vic" Arena, who wanted to be recognized as the official boss. The war was brutal, even by mob standards. Between 1991 and 1993, a dozen people were killed and many more wounded in shootings across New York. The violence was often reckless: shots fired in broad daylight, car bombings, and attacks that endangered civilians. The FBI's response was aggressive. Agents saturated Colombo family territories with surveillance. They arrested dozens of members and associates. They flipped several members into becoming cooperating witnesses, including some who provided crucial testimony about murders and racketeering. The war ended not with a clear victor, but with exhaustion and massive federal prosecutions. Both Persico loyalists and Arena faction members went to prison. The family that emerged from the conflict was decimated, many leaders dead or imprisoned, operations disrupted, and membership depleted. The Colombo family in the 21st century bears little resemblance to the organization Joe Colombo led. Federal prosecutors estimate the family now has fewer than 100 made members, down from several hundred at its peak. Its criminal operations have shrunk accordingly. The family maintains some traditional rackets. They have residual influence in certain labor unions and construction industry activities. They operate loan sharking and illegal gambling operations, though on a much smaller scale than previous decades. Some members have been involved in stock fraud and other white-collar crimes. But the Colombo family is widely considered the weakest of New York's 5 families. The Gambino and Genovese families are more powerful and wealthier. Even the Bonanno and Lucchese families, which have faced their own serious problems, are generally considered stronger than the Colombos. Several factors explain the family's decline beyond just law enforcement pressure. The internal wars, the Gallo Wars of the 1960s, the conflicts of the 1990s, killed and imprisoned members while generating no profit. The family destroyed itself through internecine conflict. Leadership quality also declined. While Joe Colombo had significant flaws, he was intelligent, charismatic, and capable of strategic thinking. Many subsequent leaders were less capable, more paranoid, or simply unlucky in facing relentless federal prosecution. The family also suffered from high-profile defections. Members who became cooperating witnesses provided devastating testimony in trials. Michael Francesi, a Colombo family captain who generated millions through gasoline tax fraud schemes in the 1980s, eventually left the mob and became a motivational speaker and author describing his criminal past. In recent years, the Colombo family has faced continued legal problems. In 2021, federal prosecutors charged several members with racketeering, including extortion of labor unions and a businessman. The charges demonstrated that the family remains active, but the scale of operations was much reduced from previous eras. The family today exists primarily in Brooklyn, particularly in neighborhoods like Bensonhurst, Dyker Heights, and parts of Queens. These areas, once strongholds of Italian-American culture and mob influence, have changed dramatically with gentrification and demographic shifts.
Part 8. Legacy and Lessons. Joe Colombo's story offers unique insights into organized crime, ethnic identity, and the changing nature of the American Mafia in the second half of the 20th century. His brief time in the spotlight revealed contradictions and tensions that continue to resonate. Colombo's attempt to build a political movement while leading a crime family represented an unprecedented experiment in American mob history. No boss before or since has tried to create a mass organization that claimed to represent an entire ethnic community's civil rights interests. The experiment failed for several fundamental reasons. First, the contradiction was ultimately unsustainable. You cannot simultaneously be a civil rights leader fighting discrimination and a crime boss ordering murders and extortion. The two roles conflict at a basic moral and practical level. Second, Colombo underestimated how other mob leaders would react to his public activities. The traditional mafia operated on principles of secrecy and denial. Bosses like Carlo Gambino understood that organized crime survived by remaining invisible, not by courting publicity. Colombo's activities threatened this approach. By publicly acknowledging his leadership position, even while denying criminal activity, by creating a high-profile organization, and by challenging law enforcement openly. He drew attention to organized crime at a time when most bosses wanted to avoid scrutiny. Third, the League ultimately demonstrated the danger of mixing legitimate and criminal enterprises. Some Italian Americans joined the League with genuine intentions to fight discrimination. When they discovered its true nature, they felt betrayed and used. This damaged the cause of combating anti-Italian stereotypes rather than helping it. The question of who ordered Colombo's shooting remains one of organized crime's enduring mysteries. The three main theories, Joe Gallo, Carlo Gambino, and other bosses, or a disturbed lone gunman, each have supporting and contradictory evidence. The Gallo theory is popular because of the obvious motive: revenge for years of conflict and imprisonment. Gallo had the criminal connections to recruit or manipulate Jerome Johnson. His assassination less than a year after Colombo was shot suggests the Colombo family believed he was responsible. The "commission ordered it" theory argues that Colombo's public activities threatened all mob families, giving the boss's motive to remove him. Using a seemingly random shooter like Johnson would provide deniability. Carlo Gambino, who had sponsored Colombo's rise and then became frustrated with his protégé's behavior, would be the likely organizer. The lone gunman theory holds that Johnson, possibly mentally disturbed and definitely desperate for money, acted independently or was manipulated by someone with a personal grudge against Colombo. This seems least likely given Johnson's lack of obvious motive and the difficulty of getting close enough to shoot a mob boss. We will likely never know definitively. Those who might know, whether Gallo associates, Gambino family members, or others, are dead or will never talk. The truth went to the grave with the participants. What we can assess is the impact of Colombo's career on organized crime and Italian-American identity. For the Mafia, Colombo's fate served as a clear lesson: stay out of the spotlight. After his shooting, mob bosses returned to the old model of invisibility that had served them well. This approach would persist until John Gotti's rise in the 1980s. Gotti, the dapper Don who courted media attention and became a celebrity mobster, seemed to ignore the lessons of Colombo's fate. Like Colombo, Gotti's publicity eventually contributed to his downfall. He was convicted in 1992 and died in prison. For Italian Americans, the Colombo affair complicated efforts to combat genuine discrimination and stereotyping. Legitimate organizations working on these issues had to constantly distinguish themselves from Colombo's League. The episode seemed to confirm the worst stereotypes that Colombo claimed to be fighting. Yet Colombo had tapped into real frustrations. Italian Americans in the 1960s and 1970s did face stereotyping and discrimination. Media depictions often portrayed them as criminals or buffoons. Law enforcement did focus disproportionately on Italian organized crime, while other ethnic criminal organizations operated with less scrutiny. The tragedy is that these legitimate concerns became associated with a mob boss's self-serving campaign. A genuine civil rights movement addressing real issues became impossible to separate from criminal manipulation. Colombo's personal story is ultimately a tragedy. He rose from the streets of Brooklyn to lead a powerful crime family and create a national political movement. For a brief moment, he seemed to have achieved something remarkable: power, influence, and a form of respectability. But it was built on a foundation of violence and crime that could never provide true legitimacy. The bullets that destroyed his brain on June 28, 1971, ended not just his career, but revealed the hollowness of his achievements. The movement collapsed, the power evaporated,
the family descended into chaos. He spent 7 years in a vegetative state, a living reminder of the wages of his choices. His family watched him deteriorate. His organization fractured. His legacy became one of cautionary lessons rather than achievements. The Italian-American Civil Rights League exists today, but barely. It's a minor organization with little influence or membership. Annual Italian Unity Day celebrations still occur, but they're small community events, nothing like the massive rallies of 1970 and 1971. Joe Colombo wanted to change how America viewed Italian Americans and how the Mafia operated in modern society. Instead, he became an example of the oldest mob lesson: those who seek the spotlight eventually get burned by it. He tried to have it both ways, criminal boss and civil rights leader, and ended up with nothing. In the end, Joe Colombo's story is about the fundamental contradictions of trying to build something legitimate on a foundation of crime, of seeking respectability while ordering murders, of claiming to fight discrimination while running a criminal enterprise that reinforced every negative stereotype. It was always going to end in blood.